I guess we can start. I see Paul here. Thank you for joining us, Paul. And I see that we already have many of our friends in the OECD community, the ambassadors, the experts. Marilyn is here, your discussant, so it's great. So let's just, without any further ado, start this conversation where we are so pleased to welcome Professor Paul Krugman to the NIAC Exiting and Learning from the COVID-19 Pandemic series. These virtual seminars, Paul, provide an opportunity to discuss the latest thinking on the likely trajectory of the COVID crisis, bringing thinkers all around the world to share with us what their views are on this situation that we confront and that is really unprecedented. We thought we have seen it all, and I am Mexican, so I have been going through several crises each decade a new crisis, but this one is just uncomparable in terms of the synchronicity and in terms of the impact and the areas that it's covering. The NIAC work on systems thinking and resilience has emphasized that the exit path is going to be bumpy and probably longer than we expect. But the whole reflection that we have been holding also tell us that it depends on the kind of decisions that we take now. There are many challenges short-term, there are medium, long-term, social, health, economic, financial, but the reality is that policies matter and they will probably make it easier or more difficult with the objective of how do we build back better, which is what we have had from the conversations that we hold in this series. We had Michael Spence, for example, who discussed the danger of the crisis presented to the firm, to the household, and to the governments and the financial sector balance sheet. And how do we treat this accumulation of debt if you really want to relaunch a rapid recovery? We also have Daniel Roderick, who was again reflecting on the issue of what the governments, the state can do, how the markets can be also contributing, but changing some of the paths that we have followed that put us in a very vulnerable situation. And so we are so glad that you join us also to share your views. You have been a very active analyst and commentator on the situation that we are confronting now. For the audience, I don't think Paul needs any introduction, but let me just say that he's a distinguished professor of economics at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and a columnist of the New York Times. In 2008, Paul was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Science for his contribution to new trade theory and new economic geography. Those of us that studied international trade theory had to go through your books, Paul, with Maurice Obstel. But beyond that, I think that this is something Secretary General Gurria could not join us, but he said that one of the talents of Paul is to really dissect very complex issues, but presented in a way that is very easy for people to understand. You are the author or editor of 27 books, 200 scholarly articles, and regular contributions to the New York Times, Fortune, and State. All the issues, trade policy from trade theory to globalization, to issues related to inequalities, to issues related to financial markets, to issues related to the regional economics. And so we are really so glad that you are joining us today. And we remember that in 2008, you make a very strong point that the 2008 crisis need to be dealt with trillions of stimulus packages. Of course, there were very important measures taken at the time, but not in the trillions. And now we are where we are. We're really talking about huge stimulus packages. And no wonder, because we were discussing with you the question of how much this crisis fell at the worst moment. Of course, crises are never presenting themselves in a moment that we feel strong, but this one was particularly at the very bad moment in terms of the high level of corporate and public debt, in terms of the fragilities of the financial system, in terms of the inequalities and how COVID has become a magnifier of this crisis. So all these elements, we really want to hear from you. We want to learn from you. And we really thank you for coming because we know how highly demanded you are in many circles. So great to have you, Paul. We will have Barry Lin as our discussant. He is a NIAC friend, but also the head of the Open Markets Institute. And then if Laurence Boone, our chief economist, is able to detach herself from the Economic Policy Committee, may make some points. And if not, we'll just open the floor to the participants. So the floor is yours, Paul, and thank you for coming.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. I have to say, there's at least not having to fly to Paris has some advantages. But let me just launch in. I don't think we had a formal title for the talk, but I've been calling it "This Time Really Is Different," homage to Reinhardt and Rogoff. And this is really it is a different kind of crisis, but it turns out, I think, that there are huge uncertainties, but I think in terms of a framework for thinking about at least the initial stages of the economics, we're in pretty good shape. There's been a lot of very fast work in analyzing. Anyway, what I want to do is not talk too long, but maybe 20, 25 minutes if I can hold it to that. Some background. I'm afraid that what I'm going to say is going to be pretty US-centric because that's the data that I've been looking at, and also actually, to be honest, we're still waiting for a lot of crucial data from Europe. A lot of the things that we can track in the US, you can't yet get, at least as far as I can tell, from the European side. So I'm going to try to share some slides, and that's so I think I've got this technology under control as to walk through where we are, what I think are the issues. So I'm going to share screen here, and if I've got this right, I now do.
You made it.
Well, the important thing here, by the way, is not to getting to the screen, but getting the settings right so I can get back to Zoom. So technical advice for people: you need to make sure that the PowerPoint is on the is on your primary monitor setting. Anyway, so this is the U.S. change in employment by month in thousands, and as everyone has been saying, all charts look the same these days. There's a speed of decline that we've never seen before. In the month of April, there was some started already in March, but April just completely unprecedented decline. And I'll give you one more slide. The decline in the U.S. it's very concentrated. It's not an across-the-board slump. It's leisure and hospitality, travel and hotels and restaurants, retail trade, healthcare, rather surprisingly. In the middle of a pandemic, healthcare employment has fallen. That's because elective procedures have been called off. People are not going to the dentist. Government, turns out that this is for the U.S., the government sector decline is, it's not yet mostly austerity, although that will be coming unless we have a relief package for state and local governments. So far, it's largely things like in-person classes canceled and temporary employees who were involved in that are not employed. So, but it's basically high contact activities have largely been shut down. People have been asking me, should we think of this as a demand shock or a supply shock? And the answer is yes and no. It doesn't fit into those categories at all. It doesn't fit into our standard views. Our standard views think of the economy as being reasonably well approximated by a single sector. And that's how when we do the demand-supply distinction. What's happened instead is you need to, at least at minimum, to think of the economy as being two sectors: a high-contact, non-essential sector that we can put on ice, and the rest. And so that's what's happened. We both demand and supply for high contact goods have gone. Hotels are not allowed to open, and nobody is trying to go to hotels. So that's the nature of the shock. There is a concern, and it's a real one, that the shit. Okay, I just learned something about this. Get back here. Okay, there is a realistic concern that whether this shock to part of the economy will spread to the rest, whether it will spread through people who can't work in the closed down sectors, cutting spending elsewhere, and this leading to a sort of second round demand shock to the economy as a whole, and also a financial shock where the financial disruptions caused by the troubles of firms in the afflicted sectors spread more broadly. The jury is somewhat out on the Keynesian side. The financial side, the shock did happen, but at least for now has been contained by action. And so let me show you what we don't know yet, because this is a big uncertainty where I am actually not sure where we are right now. I'm going to try to do this again. Going to do it again as slideshow. New frontiers in high frequency economic data. Monthly data turn out to be lag just way too far behind events for us to actually keep track of what's happening. So one group using basically survey data from private firms. This is Ernie Tedeschi and colleagues. Their data suggests that we had this incredible drop in April, but that was kind of a one-time event. And so if that's right, then the Keynesian concerns are misplaced. But unfortunately, other data, purchasing manager indexes, don't say that. They actually say that the descent is continuing at a somewhat slower but still terrifying pace. And I don't think I know the answer to that. But I think the policy implications are the same either way. That's where we are. We've had, I think, the worst monthly decline in history, incredible burden. We don't really know whether that's the end of that story, and to the extent that it has been contained or is going to be contained, that's crucially dependent on policy, which I'll get back to in a moment. Let me just say a word then about the financial side, and in fact, there's a point here that many people have been talking about, which is stock markets have, after losing heavily, have somewhat rebounded, actually largely rebounded. Is this a implicit forecast from the market that everything is going to be all right? I don't think that's the right interpretation. Now, first of all, the market doesn't necessarily know anything that the rest of us don't. But secondly, in fact, the story here is you need to look a little bit more at the markets. So again, moving on to, here's the figure that first you probably want to look at, again, US data. If the people based in Europe don't know about FRED, which it's mostly US centric, but not entirely, but wow, is that a convenient resource at almost all times. Stock market is the red line, that's the S&P 500, which fell off a cliff earlier this year, but has rebounded more than half the way. The blue line is the 10-year treasury, the benchmark long-term security, which has fallen a lot. And there was some disruption in there. It spiked a little bit but then it's back down. Is actually still very, very close to its lows. Long-term bond yields are an implicit forecast of where the economy is going to go, because they reflect what people think the central bank is going to do on short-term rates. And the long-term bond market is telling us that investors believe that we're going to be a depressed economy for a long time. The stock market, well, one thing, with bond yields so low, stocks look attractive. It's simply because there isn't an alternative. And so you wouldn't be too surprised to see stocks holding up fairly well, given how low interest rates have plunged. And the question would be, well, what was that plunge and then recovery about? The answer is that we actually almost had. We had an incipient financial crisis back in March. The losses that investors were taking in firms directly affected by the coronavirus were spilling over into a broader sell-off. Some combination of psychological contagion maybe, but also balance sheets. Relevant investors had taken a hit to their balance sheets, and they were being forced to sell other assets. And so we had something, we were ready to have another post-Lehman crisis for a couple of weeks in March. But we didn't in the end because of intervention. So the Federal Reserve intervened enormously. This shows one measure of financial disruption, the rate on commercial paper, which was a good index in 2008 and is a good index now to tell you where things are going. The Fed established a new facility to buy commercial paper. It went in and bought lots of assets and expressed its willingness to buy others. So the Fed announced it was willing to buy junk bond ETFs, which is unprecedented. And those things, both because of the actual purchases and because of the implied safety net for asset prices, that really contained the crisis. We sort of had, I would say that March 23rd was the equivalent for the US financial market of Mario Draghi's whatever it takes moment in 2012, where he said that the ECB was willing to buy debt of troubled European countries and never actually had to do it. The mere statement contained the crisis there. So we have, in fact, dealt with the financial side, at least for now. There's a question about whether that's only a temporary reprieve, which I guess I'll get back to in a few minutes. Let's talk about the incomes side of the economy. So we have had we've had an extraordinary increase in public deficits. Actually, one more slide. Just no, actually, I'll have a couple more, but let me do this for now. Again, every chart looks the same, right? This is the monthly federal budget balance in the United States, and nothing like this ever before. I mean, that fluctuates a lot seasonally, but the fluctuations are invisible compared with what we've just seen. So huge deficits driven partly by a collapse of revenue, partly by extraordinary outlays. The right way, people keep on talking about stimulus packages. That's both a poor description of what policy has been, and it's a poor description of what policy should be doing right now. The situation of the economy, I've been using the metaphor, it's like a medically induced coma. We've deliberately shut down some functions in order to survive temporarily. Hopefully we'll shut down those functions. So that, in fact, we want people not to be economically active. We want people not to be leaving their homes and going to the office and crowding into spaces. We want this shutdown. It's actually a desirable turn of events. The purpose of economic policy here should be primarily to make that temporary shutdown tolerable, to guard against extreme economic hardship. So it takes the form, it's really more disaster relief than it is stimulus. Everybody has kind of scrambled to find ways to do this. The United States response has been somewhat shambolic, but better than many people realize. What we did was I think the most important thing was an enormous expansion of both the scope and the value of unemployment benefits, so that unemployed workers, including people who had previously not been able to get unemployment benefits, gig economy workers, independent contractors, have become eligible, and everybody is getting $600 extra a week as unemployment compensation. That's a really big deal. It got off to a very rocky start because of administrative incapacity. The unemployment offices are run by the states, and they really weren't capable of handling the load, partly by design. They were designed to make it hard to get benefits, but we're gradually working past that. And there's some people who are working on this that tell me that more than 2/3 of the unemployed are now getting benefits, which is, by US standards, that's a very high number. And at this point, probably something like 3/4 of the wage loss from unemployment is being made up by unemployment benefits. Other countries have relied on more on payroll subsidies, subsidizing firms to keep workers on payroll. So Denmark being the first major example, but now the UK is doing something like that. Others are doing something like that. Let me say that it's not at all clear that I feel like there's an idealized European response, which is pay companies to keep workers on their payrolls and retain their connection to the company. And there's an idealized US response, or North American response, because Canadians are doing some similar things, which is to provide generous benefits to people who've lost their jobs because of COVID-19. It's not clear that the European response is better. Normally we tend to think that Europe does safety net programs better than the US does, and that is mostly true, though not always. But in this case, the thing that worries me about the Danish-style program is that it presumes that the post-COVID economy will look pretty much the same as the pre-COVID economy, that the same jobs will come back once the pandemic recedes, and that's not at all clear. And so a program that is focused on helping people who've lost their jobs until new jobs come along actually does make some sense. It's odd, actually, in terms of healthcare. The US famously has healthcare linked to employment, and Europe provides it regardless. And that's a better solution on the European side. When it comes to dealing with the job consequences of this crisis, we've actually reversed roles, where Europe is tying unemployment relief to employers, and the United States is making it actually portable. And that's time will tell. But we're doing all right, at least not all right. We're doing much better than people realize. It started out as a D grade, and it's now kind of a B-, I think, in terms of that. Also, the United States has a lending program for small business that is an attempt to do something like what Europe is doing. And also it's loans that turn into grants if you use the money to maintain payroll. And that's been a much worse administered program than the expansion of unemployment benefits, even though that didn't go so great to begin with either. But it's something along at this point, most small businesses appear to have gotten loans and are trying to use it to sustain employment. The big problem that we have in terms of the response is that this quickly cobbled together safety net to deal with the induced coma will be snatched away unless there's additional policy. Those small business loans that for sustaining employment, the window to turn them into a grant is only 8 weeks, and many firms are already halfway through that. So we're actually talking about within a month, a lot of firms will start to lay off workers. We just haven't, and we need time, and we haven't done that. The unemployment benefits expire July 31st, and at that point, if we still have very high unemployment, which we certainly will, then we're snatching away an absolutely critical part of the safety net. And we talk a lot about how Europe has a problem of lack of fiscal integration and problems of, and Franco-German proposal, which I have not examined closely, is a first step maybe towards doing that. But the United States has state and local governments, which employ 20 million workers and which are required to balance their budgets and are under extreme stress. And there has been no significant aid to those governments. So we have a big problem of probably withdrawing the safety net way, way too soon. Everything depends upon the virus, but all indications are that we're really, even if we try to reopen, first of all, there may well be a second surge in infections, and governments may say it's okay to go out and resume your normal life, but if people are still frightened, they won't. And we're seeing some preliminary evidence that state reopenings are not actually producing the kind of economic surge they thought they would. Okay, now all of this government stuff, the safety net provision, costs a lot of money at a time when revenues have plunged, and so the deficit has surged. And I think the big issue there is, should we be worried? Should we be worried about all of this debt? And let me just give you 2 points to make. And this is, now we're revisiting some of the same territory we did in 2010 and afterwards, when this push for austerity that I lamented and all of that did a lot of harm. Now here we are, we're seeing a big increase in debt, and there are already many voices saying, oh, this is unsustainable. And we must curtail these programs because we can't do that. So we need a little perspective here. The Congressional Budget Office in the United States says that we will be, their current projection, which of course they themselves will say, well, they don't really know, but their current projection is that debt will rise from 80% of GDP to 108% of GDP over the course of the next 2 years. That's only federal debt, so you want to add sort of 20% for collective government debt, but still, that'll give you a sense. At one level, that's a huge amount. On another level, historically, it's not actually out of the range that many countries have successfully dealt with. I like to point people to the historical experience of the UK. Particularly, just look at UK at the end of World War II. Debt was over 250% of GDP, but there was no crisis. How did the UK pay off that debt? It didn't. The nominal debt actually continued to grow, but the economy grew faster. So that even though the UK on average ran small budget deficits for the 35 years after World War II, the debt declined by 3/4 as a share of GDP. And so historically, advanced countries have been able to run debt at this level and have not needed to pay it off. They can just let it erode. This is where it becomes very important to make the point that Olivier Blanchard made so forcefully a little over a year ago, that others have been making for some time, which is that interest rates have consistently been below growth rates. And so we really don't need to worry about a sort of snowballing debt effect where you're obliged to run ever larger primary surpluses because of the interest burden of debt. Just a quick, my last picture here. I just ran some hypothetical debt paths for the United States based on that CBO estimate that will close out with a debt of 108% of GDP, and that that, as has roughly been true in the past and is true in projections over the next 10 years, that the interest rate is 1% below the growth rate. If we were to have primary balance, then debt would steadily decline over time. If we had a primary deficit of 2% of GDP, then which is, as it happens, it is roughly what the United States was running before the 2017 tax cut, so it's not a very distant goal. Debt would be rising. you would be seeing eventually, over time, debt would rise considerably. But the operative word there is eventually. Even with that 2% of GDP deficit, debt in 2050 would still be well below levels that the UK experienced for most of the 20th century. So we want to have a perspective there that says that these debt accumulations are not actually especially scary. I think basically the big risk for in terms of policy is again that we will do too little, that we will withdraw aid, and there's an interdependence between health policy and economic policy. If you fail to provide an adequate social safety net, then the urge to reopen prematurely becomes much stronger, and that can lead to the worst of all worlds. We can lead to a second wave of infections, a further lockdown, and the economic costs, as well as the large numbers of lives lost, becomes a big deal. I think that there are a lot of issues I should raise, but I think I'm probably better if we can throw it open for questions and I can respond, because I'm sure that people will want to ask about corporate debt, emerging markets, some of which I have answers to and some of which I don't. But that's where we are right now. We're in a necessary, desirable lockdown. It costs a lot of money to sustain, to avoid severe hardship during this period. That's money that is well worth spending, that we should be spending, and now is not the time to worry about the debt that we're incurring.
Thank you so much, Paul, and I appreciate your interest in engaging. I would actually later send some of the pieces you have written that expand on the initial propositions you're making here in terms of how much this support that was provided, call it a stimulus or not, needs to continue for the time being. And then you were making very concrete proposals on how much we need to be investing in infrastructure and trying to really foster some of the underlying elements to push for growth. But thank you for making room for the debate. I will give the floor to Barry Lin for his comments, and then I will open the floor. I think that our Deputy Secretary General Ulrik Knudsen has raised his hand because he's Danish. So, Paul, I think you got into some good debate here. Yeah. So, but I will first give the floor to Barry Lin, please.
Yes, thank you, Gabriela, and also thank you, Paul, for sort of taking the time to do this. It's great to have you sort of participating in this conversation. And actually, just a personal note, Paul, in the life of my Open Markets Institute, Paul played a major role back in 2012 when he sort of wrote about an article that we had written, that we had published a couple years earlier about the role of consolidation in sort of reducing the number of jobs and the quality of jobs in the United States. And when Paul Krugman writes about something, it becomes an important fact. And so Paul played a major role in sort of boosting our organization at a key moment. I'm not going to take long. I'm just going to raise a couple of questions here, and because I know that we have more than 160 people on the call, and there's certainly enough questions from this remarkably sort of sophisticated audience. But one thing that you sort of touched on, which is this issue actually relating to Denmark, the sort of implicit in your comment about the difference between the U.S. and the European responses in terms of how we deal with unemployment is this question of what the economy of the future will look like. And it sort of your insinuation or your implication was that the economy of the future may look radically different or substantially different. And I was just wondering if this is, do you have ideas about some of the ways in which this crisis may change the political economy in fundamental ways?
Oh boy. The political economy, I have no idea what I'm talking about in general right now, but particularly about the political economy, God knows. I mean, we've been. It's always really hard to judge where that's going to go, and for all I know, that we will learn nothing, or we'll learn the wrong lessons, or how many. I would say that I would have expected, ex ante, I did expect that the 2008 crisis would lead to a significant shift towards to the left in the United States, that we would have a crackdown on financial irresponsibility, none of which really happened. I mean, we got expansion of healthcare, but the political landscape didn't at all replicate our vision of what happened in the Great Depression. Let's talk about the economics, though, for a second. There's a whole. The big issues here are, first of all, to what extent does a certain amount of fear persist? So will people ever again feel as comfortable about packed subways and large meetings? And probably that will fade over time, but it may take some time. But also to the extent that we've actually had a learning by doing in alternative ways of conducting activities. So one of the things that did happen, this is maybe a strange parallel, but in the United States, the food stamps, the nutritional assistance program, it shot up during the Great Recession. It came down. A number of people on it came down, but not all the way back to where it was before. And what seems to have happened is that large numbers of people were forced onto the program, having never before contemplated doing that, and learned that there was this program, that it was pretty helpful for their lives. Now, in this case, not talking so much about the social assistance programs, although I kind of hope that unemployment benefits will remain more available in the future. But think about telecommuting. Think about what we're doing right now. Business has been very reluctant to move in this direction, but now large numbers of people are experiencing the ability to hold Zoom meetings. And I believe that the experience so far, and this is very casual, that has been sufficiently positive that we probably will not go back to as many in-person meetings, that we will have a sustained increase in telecommuting. All of which then in turn means that substantial parts of the economy, from the hotel and airline businesses to commercial real estate, will simply not return to where they were before, and that other things will have grown. And that means that we can easily be talking about, in the United States, 10, 15 million current jobs being displaced by new ways of doing business. And so it's substantial. Lots of stuff will go back, given time. I suspect that, I should probably just stop there and say that it's not going to be everything. Lots of things people will want to go to restaurants once they feel it's safe. But a lot of things will not come back and will be replaced by different things. So there's going to be probably a significant, there's going to be hysteresis in the structure of business, simply because people have learned that things that they've been avoiding experimenting with, in fact, are doable.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you, Paul. And yes, there are so many things that we don't know how they will evolve. I will give the floor to DSG Knudsen, and then we have the head of our business at the OECD, and then the ambassador of Spain, the ambassador of Korea, and the ambassador of Chile, very good friends of Nike. But I would want you also to reflect, Paul, because what you're saying is that, yes, this might induce a very great change in the way we operate, but let's not forget that you still have half of the world population without any connection to anything.
Right.
in terms of internet. And so the inequalities stories that you have also been very keen at addressing will be important to factor in this debate. So let's go for Ulrich, and then we go for Russell, please.
Thank you, Gabriela. Thank you, Professor Krugman, for these interesting insights. Tempting as it may be as a Dane to start an argument over the Danish approach, I'm not going to do so. I think you're right that it'll mostly depend on how much the economy will have changed after the crisis, and then we can have a discussion on whether it'll be a big change or a small change. The defense of each approach will certainly depend on that. But no, I would actually rather, now that I have the opportunity, 26 years after I wrote my thesis from the University of Copenhagen on trade, with you as a major source for that thesis, I would actually like to take the opportunity to ask you what your view is on this discussion that will be extremely important over the next months and years on globalization and resilience. We've had a discussion about this before. I think we're trying to take the company view that there should be no trade-off, there should be no dilemma between improving the resilience and continuing with the globalization. But there is also, of course, a risk that nationalists and populists will hijack the resilience agenda as the new buzzword for protectionism and looking inward. I think that's a real danger as we proceed in making our systems and the interlinked nature of our systems more resilient. I think there will be calls from governments to, also legitimate calls from governments to shorten a certain value change, to have more self-sufficiency when it comes to medicine and food. Some may want to expand that into energy and telecommunications. But I think that's where it starts getting dangerous, because then it could become a trend to the detriment of the whole multilateral trading system that has served us so well over the last, I guess more than 70 years. So my question to you, Professor Krugman, is looking at globalization and trade, what do you think should happen, and what do you think will happen?
Okay.
Why don't we, Paul, why don't we take a round of questions?
Oh, okay, good, because we don't have that much time. Great.
No, and also because they might have some things that are also linked.
Okay.
Russell Mills from BIAC. Then I have Ambassador Escudero from Spain, Ambassador Ko from Korea, and Ambassador Morante from Chile, in that order, please. And then we give the floor to...
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed. Very, very interesting. And I think from a business standpoint, when we look at the monumental borrowing, but at the same time, relatively long maturities possible, very low interest rates, one of the questions we're asking ourselves is, will we be able to grow our way out of this crisis, or is it going to be, our government's going to inflate their way out of the crisis? So part of the question is whether you see inflation or deflation as the bigger risk. I think partly linked to that is your comments on how we view the job outlook before COVID and after COVID, because in some respects, this is like a very accelerated version of what was happening in the digitalization debate. When a lot of digitalization technologies were coming in, it appeared as though many jobs would disappear. But when we saw all kinds of new business models being looked at, then in some cases, the situation was not quite as bad as it looked. I mean, there's many examples in retail where contactless options may be possible. I do agree the productivity possible for business using all the global technologies on internet-enabled tools has probably worked better than expected. So just be interested in your views on that, to what extent, should we say, once the US innovation machine has been unleashed in crisis mode, will that yield positive surprises, which we may have not taken sufficient account of? Thank you.
Ambassador Escudero, Spain. You're muted, Ambassador.
Sorry.
There you are.
Yeah, can you hear me? Sorry?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Oh, yeah, I was saying that it's a privilege to hear you, sir, today, and thank you very much for tonight for organizing this. Three questions. The first one is true that we cannot talk about the stimulus packages when we are somehow with the economy hibernating, and what they are doing. What we are doing really is keeping alive both the incomes of people and the companies through liquidity and so on and so forth. That is not a stimulus. That's simply keeping things in a hibernation with not much damage. But I wonder, I think, and that is the important question, whether or not we are facing a two-phase situation in which when we start actually going into recovery, we'll have to have actually a stimulus package because we'll have probably to give a push to aggregate demand since demand is going to be, shaking, is going to be unclear in many sectors, is going to have problems in terms of exports and so on and so forth. So my question is, do we need a stimulus package at the beginning of the recovery to jumpstart the economy at that moment? That's the first question. The second one is that, I'm not going to enter, in the relative merits of helicopter money, or keeping workers under the payroll with short-term workers schemes, as we are doing in Europe. Certainly in Spain, it's the first time that we have used that. Because of that, we can say that 3 million people, 3 million workers are not unemployed, but are within, the payroll of companies. And that for us really means that we are keeping the economic fabric alive and ready for recovery. So in that sense, we see a merit of, keeping people, under payroll, even if it's, with being paid by the unemployment benefits, but with a contract with the company, because then, the loss of talent is going to be less and the harm for companies is going to be less too. And finally, the final question, debt. I am very glad that you are saying that debt probably is not going to be a big issue in general, you would say, or you were saying, but I wonder about developing countries. What's going to happen with them? Because obviously, what is happening is a clear proof or clear challenge from the point of view of their resilience. And I wonder to what extent that cannot be a big, huge problem for them in the near future. Thank you.
Now we have Ambassador of Korea, Mr. Ko, please.
Thank you, Gabriela, and thank you, Dr. Krugman. I'm so much honored to meet you here, although this meeting is virtual. When I was a young official in the Korean Ministry of Finance, my division director was your big fan, reading all of your articles. And later, he became the Deputy Prime Minister of Korea.
Okay.
And I'd like to ask you just one question. I do see some contradicting views regarding the possibility of inflation, which may be led by cheap money injected by central banks and treasuries, and also supply chain disruptions versus deflation that may be led by low demand and low growth rate. After this pandemic crisis, I would like to hear your views about that. Stay healthy and safe. Thank you very much.
And now we have the ambassador from Chile, Felipe Morande, and we'll get back the floor to you.
Very much, Gabriela, and thank you very much, Professor Krugman. Perhaps you won't remember, but when I organized the Latin American meeting of the Econometric Society in 1989, I invited you, and I have the honor to have you in my home, in my house at that time. So glad to see you again. I have a couple of questions. One concerns developing countries, as well as Manuel was saying before. And it is the following. Don't you have the impression that given the huge amount of liquidity that is going to be with us for many time, then that of the developing country won't be such a big problem in the future, because there's always going to be appetite for risk in investors. So I don't see really a debt overhang in many emerging economies. Not all of them, of course. Some of them will be doing pretty bad in that sense, but most of them will see no real impact. We see even today that prospects for, say, South American economies are not very good, as for everyone else, of course. You don't see any huge increase in spreads. So I guess markets are discounting that even though they're going to be with higher levels of debt in the future, they will be able to repay eventually. So with that sort of liquidity, abounding liquidity that we will have, my guess is that we're not going to see any really or burdensome debt overhang in many developing economies. The second question is completely different, perhaps, and that is, how would be the world after a vaccine is discovered and implemented? Because we are here in a world where we could be facing two different equilibria. One in which we don't have the vaccine for a long time, and where we will have a very hard time. And then the other world, the other equilibrium is one in which a vaccine is discovered soon, and soon meaning before the first half of next year. And what are the chances that the world will be back into business as usual in that scenario? Because people will lose fear for traveling, for meeting in restaurants, and they will be again willing to enjoy life. And so all the industry you mentioned that we are now locked down will kind of be reborn again. And so we will be in a very different world. Of course, there will be many scars, many injuries in the path to that scenario. But if that is, coming soon meaning, as I said before, at the end of first semester of next year, then perhaps the world would be very much like it used to be. Thank you.
Okay, so the floor is yours, Paul.
Okay, wow. I don't think I can deal with everything here. Let me do three things that came up. First, the future of globalization. Now, the thing about the coronavirus is not spread by physical goods. A container load of goods shipped from Asia to Europe is not an infection vector. So the technology of globalization should not really be all that affected. And I was wondering early on whether to what extent do extended supply chains depend upon human contact? We were basically the manager flying out to the plant in Southeast Asia to talk with people, and because before this we had a lot of that, tremendous amount of international travel linked to maintaining global supply chains. But I think the same things that make me think we may be having some underlying structural change, which is the fact that meetings like this one have turned out to be much more workable than people, I think, previously realized, also suggest that those effects are not that large. So in terms of the economics of globalization, I don't think it has been much affected at all. The political economy is another issue. And particularly this US-China conflict is not a good sign for the global trading system. We've already been having major political stresses. And I would add, and this is a more second subtle point, but I think a really important one. Despite everything, the global system still depends upon a fair bit of benevolent US hegemony. The trading system is a little bit joint US-EU hegemony, but it still, it requires that the US take a leadership position and have a substantial amount of soft power that helps to sustain it. And the US, basically disastrous US response to this crisis, has done a lot of damage to America's reputation, made us even less able, even if we have a change of management in the U.S., makes us even less able than we were before to be the stabilizing hegemon on the global system. So I'm actually much more worried about the political economy of globalization than I am about the technological side. Just a word about, these are actually linked questions about the borrowing at long maturities and liquidity and so on. I didn't get into this at all, but there are some, first of all, there's some illusions about what's going on. Certainly for the US. The US government is issuing a lot of long-term debt, but a lot of that is being bought by the Fed. But it's not really, the Fed isn't really printing money. What the Fed is doing is it's serving as a conduit. There's been a very sharp increase in private sector saving, which has largely been used not to buy US government debt, but been put into banks. But the banks have then accumulated those funds as reserves at the Fed, and the Fed is in effect relending those. So what looks like a huge monetary expansion isn't, it is formally the monetary base is way up, but it isn't really. What it really is it's simply that for whatever reason, the financing of deficits is largely, effectively we have helicopter money. That's what we've been doing right now, and it's now that's means that if you're worried about that we have an inflationary expansion, that's not really what's happening. On the other hand, we have these low long-term interest rates, but we are not in reality locking them in, because the long-term borrowing is largely taking place from the central bank, and the central bank is effectively financing those purchases with overnight borrowing in the form of commercial bank reserves. So we are, in fact, leaving ourselves somewhat vulnerable should there be a future interest rate spike. The consolidated balance sheet of the central bank and the government is in fact one that is heavily reliant on very short-term funding. And that's I don't think that's going to be an issue, but it does mean that one shouldn't take too much comfort in the fact that we're seeing long-term borrowing at long rates. That's not really not being locked in. This means now, in terms of, because I don't think we are actually seeing a gigantic increase in liquidity, if you think about it right, then I'm not so worried about inflation. And what's happening right now is that we are financing disaster relief to the idled part of the economy by borrowing from the still operating part of the economy, which is saving very heavily because it doesn't have things to spend on. And all of that simultaneously be wound down. So I don't really see a big inflationary risk. There's a deflationary risk if we withdraw the safety net too soon. And so the saving is still high in the unaffected parts of the economy, but spending power on the affected parts is sharply reduced. So I think the risks are weighted heavily towards deflation rather than inflation. Doesn't mean you can't tell stories where inflation can happen. I don't think it's where we're probably likely to go. Let me say the whole. I'm not sure about developing country debt, but I'm also not sure about corporate debt. Though I think I'm even we have had here's where we saw a large increase in certain kinds of debt in the years before this crisis. We saw a large increase in corporate debt. And a large increase in emerging market debt, actually a lot of that emerging market business debt. And not clear, no, the numbers are not remotely comparable to the household debt accumulations before the 2008 crisis. But there is a question, was this excessive? Where did we get too far ahead? And should be a question that's independent of the COVID crisis. But the question is, will this crisis end up exposing some old line that says that when the house falls down, that's when you find the skeletons in the closet. That in effect, this shock causes us to reevaluate things that even though they were not specifically related to it. And I think that question is still out in the open. We don't know the answer to that yet. And If it is possible, or if we have a possible loss of confidence there, then that's where then the emerging markets become exposed. Because although the Fed can step in, it turns out to buy even junk bonds. The ECB, well, it's not clear where the ECB's after that court ruling where the ECB is, but has historically been able to do a lot. But nobody. The U.S. political system will not stand for Fed bailout operations aimed at emerging market debt. It's going to have to be domestic. So we can do swap lines and so on, but we can't. If it turns out that corporate debt in emerging markets becomes a big problem, I'm not sure who's going to address it. So that's where there's a potential threat. Now, it may be that this doesn't arise, and I've been seeing the emerging market debt spreads have followed pretty much the same course as corporate debt spreads. They shot up for a little while, and then they came down, even though there was never any prospect that the Fed was going to buy that debt. They came down a lot, and they're not so bad right now. But yeah, I mean, this is one of the, I'm still haven't done enough homework. Still trying to figure out. I mean, there are many people are warning about a massive sudden stop for emerging markets, but then it's not clear that the markets are reflecting that concern. So I don't actually know where we are there, but it's and I hope I understand that Chile is actually starting to look like it's entering liquidity trap territory. So welcome to advanced world problems. So those are the things that I think I know something about. And will we need stimulus to jumpstart the economy? I think probably not, as long as we keep the safety net in place long enough. But I could be wrong about that. That's a whole other discussion. But I believe that this is, and I've written and given some talks about saying that this is actually more like a pre-1990 recession where you have an external force, and then in that case, interest rates, now the virus lockdown that pushes back. Okay, there's lots more there, but those are the issues that those are the answers to most of those questions. And I know we're over 11 o'clock, so.
Thank you so much. And I was actually receiving a comment from Ambassador Cosonde, who wanted to raise the issue of emerging economies. And as you know, it all depends whether you get growth going. Is the best way to honor the debt in developing countries. We have Mateus Gracelli, who is a NAEC friend from McMaster University, raising his hand, and then we have the ambassador from Canada, Madeleine Chenette. So please, and then Alan Kierman, who wants our NAEC team member, so he will make some comments too. In that order, please, Mateus, Madeleine, and then Alan.
Thank you, Gabriela. So, Paul, one of the distinct features of your writings is how much mileage you can get from simple models. Of course, your liquidity trap model is a rigorous model, had all the I's crossed and T's dotted. But after the crisis, you showed in your blog many, many times how a simple understanding of things like ISLM can help people not say very stupid things. So I wonder, for those of us who cannot live without models, if you can give some guidance on a workhorse model for navigating through this crisis and future epidemiological related crisis. And in particular, so some of us work on climate economic integrated models. Is there a epidemiology economy integrated model that can help us think through it?
Should we accumulate a couple, or yeah?
Yeah, and if anybody wants to raise their hand, we have 3 now, and then I think it will be probably the last round. But we have Ambassador Chenette, and then Alan Kierman.
Mr. Krugman, nice hearing you today, and thank you for the NAEC to organize that. It's great discussion. So I've got 2 questions. One, following what my previous colleague just mentioned, is prior to this crisis, we were just discussing that the economic model needs to evolve in order to be more inclusive and look at the impact on the vulnerable people, as well as taking into consideration the climate change and the carbon impact. Do you think that this crisis will lead towards more integrating those elements and redefining how we look at our economy, or it will kind of being put on the side because there is more urgency that will be required. So that's my first question. The second question is you refer to change into the different sectors that will not be the same. The question I have is, when you think about the overall productivity, like we saw in the last few years that the productivity indicators was not always in line with what is the economic growth. So when we're looking at this current transformation that we're going to go through, like, is the productivity an indicator that it is very important to track in order to see the economic growth again? Or how do you see the impact of technology with the this productivity level? Thank you.
And I think that we are done for this round, Paul, and following Ambassador Jeanette, I would really like to take you a little bit forward in your own policy suggestions in terms of continuing investments and keeping the support systems for jobs and for the economic activity. But the whole point is, how do you differentiate? And we discussed this beforehand, the question of how COVID has magnified the inequalities that we had before. So I would ask you to include that in the question. And then Alan, I did not forget you. So come on, Alan, just take your mic off. On. Your mic.
There, is that better? Now, Paul, I wanted just to come back to the question that was asked about the vaccine. And there's always a suggestion in almost any crisis that we go through that there is some solution. And once we've got that, then we'll be sort of back on track. And I think there's a huge danger in this case for the simple reason that I don't think there is a single solution. And secondly, let's suppose we find a really safe, effective vaccine. Then you have to get people vaccinated. And what we've seen is a big movement which has actually resisted vaccination. And I think that the overall net, despite the fact that people are terribly afraid of getting COVID, they're also terribly afraid of going to the hospital and so forth and getting any sort of infection. So is it necessarily the case that we have a sort of silver bullet just because we found a vaccine? I suspect that what we're going to go through is just a string of crises, and each time people always want to look for an end to it, but there isn't an end in some sense. Does that make sense?
Okay, so so let me just in response to Alan, H.L. Mencken, for any complex problem, there is always a solution that is simple, plausible, and wrong. And there's some of that. I mean, the idea that a vaccine completely solves the problem is clearly not right. It's, among other things, the people like Laurie Garrett have been warning us about pandemics for some time, and that a globalized world and a depleted public health structure made us vulnerable to this. And if people think this is the last time this is going to happen, they're probably wrong. So, and the really major problems in implementing vaccination. So yeah, it will certainly help, but I don't think it answers all the problems. Models. I actually was, I'm a little old to be doing all of the, I don't have the patience for modeling that once I did, but I still was sitting down getting ready to try and do a minimalist model. And then across my virtual desk came Gary Arieh et al., Ivan Werning and his team, doing almost exactly the model that I was getting ready to try and write down, which is simple, two-sector. One is a high contact sector that gets shut down. The other is everything else. Multi-period, but you do some trickery to think about. So we actually do. I would recommend that as a starting point. It turns out that there are some. I noticed you picked up some I's to cross and T's to dot, and there's more sort of busy work on the modeling there, but it comes down to largely question of how much the loss of income in the quarantine sector spills over to the rest of the economy. So I actually think that's a reasonable framework. Now, it doesn't get at the things that I worry about things about the overhang, about the pace of recovery. And that's actually a much harder, not clear that people have figured out the modeling tricks, but a very simple sort of two-sector approach with as few moving parts as possible is, I think, the right way to go right now. The issues about inequality and how all this fits in. So the quick point, how did I, among others, blow it on globalization? Because I think we understated the amount of stress that globalization was going to cause because we focused on the aggregate income distribution, focused on skilled versus unskilled workers and so on. And said, okay, there are going to be some impacts here, but they're modest in size. What we missed was the extent to which the burden of change would fall heavily on particular, just almost random groups. So my favorite example, the furniture industry in the US suffered substantial job losses because of imports. But relative to the US labor market, it was a tiny thing. So you would think, how much can it matter? But the US furniture industry is largely concentrated in a few towns in North Carolina. And for them, it was a devastating economic blow. And so in this case, what's happening is it's turning out that the impacts of COVID are exacerbating inequality, even if, as measured by the Gini coefficient. But it's sort of randomly. If you happen to be employed in travel, leisure, and hospitality, then you probably lost your job. And if you happen not to be, then you didn't. And so and we really need to think in terms of policies, what makes it possible to tolerate those things. Productivity, wow. I think we're going to have real measurement issues. If I'm right that we have significant structural change, then we're going to have real problems in productivity it's essential, but also kind of ridiculous to think that there's a single number called productivity. So we need to do that, but we have real problems. If we compare, again, just looking at what we're doing right now, if we compare the number of person hours required to hold a conference, what is the output measure, and how do we match a Zoom conference with an in-person conference? And it's not the same product. But at some level we have to create a hedonic index that measures. And so how much worse obviously this is involving a lot fewer person hours than if we were all flying to Paris to get together. But how much is the quality degraded by the fact that we're not in fact face to face? And that's a trivial example. And what pundits and economists do is it's doubtful whether it's a productive social activity at all. But still, there'd be lots of things like that where we're going to have a really hard time measuring productivity in the next few years.
We have time for 2 or 3 questions. If somebody wants to comment, I don't see any hand. But Paul, please, there is one issue that probably our chief economist has made a very thorough analysis of how the OECD considers this is affecting the economic activity. And we concluded there is a demand and a supply shock both ways. So I'm not sure we are completely in line of thinking that there are some sectors that are affected, because the reality is that there are these cascading effects, that the linkages between the different activities that are really impacting each other. The question of supply chains, the question of the essential workers, as we call them, the question of the last report that the OECD delivered before we were in confinement. Right. It's a House Life report that proved that 30% additional to the low income or bottom 40% of the income distribution in OECD economies, an additional 30% were vulnerable groups, meaning they didn't have the financial means to withstand the shock for more than 3 months.
Oh, and let me just say that it is important, I think, to realize that there are, in addition to actual unemployment, there's reduced hours for many other people, and then many households have multiple earners, of whom some, which means that the range of families or households that are affected by this is substantially larger than the share of if you take, we've had probably, we know that there were some measurement issues, but in the United States, we probably, in fact, had something like a 15-point rise in unemployment. But the actual range of people who have taken an economic hit is much wider than that. Census is doing now weekly surveys, and they find that almost half of households have lost wage income because of what's going on right now. So it is a much, for some purposes, it makes sense to think of this as being a kind of a 1/5 of the economy takes the hit, but actually in terms of the individual experience of economic hardship, it's much broader, much cushioned for the moment by the programs that have been put in place. But yes, we do want to think of this as being something that affects a very, very large part of the population.
And we have Marie-Gabrielle Del Guireken, if you want to introduce yourself. And then maybe I will give just Barry and Alan some final comments very fast, and then to Paul, and we'll close. Marie-Gabrielle.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Krugman. My name is Marie-Gabrielle Del Guireken. I'm an OECD official. And I just had one very quick question, sort of related to productivity and the question by the Ambassador of Canada. Back in the 90s, your work on competitiveness and calling it a dangerous obsession and emphasizing the importance of productivity has really shaped the debate on the topic. However, given the pandemic and the resulting crisis, one could think that countries will focus particularly on improving their competitiveness as a way to promote economic growth. I wanted to ask you, what is your opinion on the impact of the pandemic on competitiveness? And is competitiveness something that regulators should consider when developing their policies? Thank you.
Okay. Just quickly, I have no idea. I'm not even sure what in general, I'm not sure I know what competitiveness means. But it's, are we competing for market share, foreign direct investment? I'm not sure that any of those really make sense as a story about where we are. And this is, hugely, it's very obviously not a zero-sum event where one country's gains come at another country's expense. We're all shutting down from this. So I don't think it's actually a helpful thing. Now, it can poison international economic relations if countries do start to fight over, turn it, among other things, blame shifting. But I just don't, I guess I don't see that as the framework for worrying about this right now.
Okay, final comment by Barry, Alan, and then we'll give it back to Paul and we'll close the session.
Yes, no, I enjoyed this conversation immensely. And, just one thing I wanted to touch on was, you had spoke about the disastrous response to this crisis by the administration, the U.S. administration, and how that's made it sort of much harder for the United States to sort of serve as a stabilizing hegemon within the system. And, I mean, I think just, for given the audience, if there's just, some thoughts that you have about, how we can create sort of stabilizing institutions somewhere in the system that function sort of at this moment of sort of crisis in which we see a lot of anger and sort of arguments and spats, and the borders have closed that may not ever open again. So what would be? Have you seen things that are particularly encouraging, and if not, how would you go about sort of creating something that would give us encouragement?
And Alan?
Yeah, thank you, Gabriella. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't want to take any of your more of your time. Paul has given us a lot. But Julian Cargesian, our friend of Nike from the Minister of Finance in Canada, wanted to ask a question. So I was just representing him in some sense too. If he can.
Julian, but you didn't raise your hand, Julian.
Oh, I did quickly.
So
I didn't. Thank you, Gabriella, Alan, Professor Krugman. Just want to say quickly, thanks to NIAC for doing the kind of thinking at international organizations that should be going on. Quick question to Professor Krugman. Even if the Fed was printing to pay for, let's say, a one-time increase in the debt resulting from an engineered shutdown in demand and supply, would even that be inflationary if it was completely monetized?
Okay. The reality is that this increase in debt that has taken place over the past 2 months has been almost completely monetized, at least on paper. If you actually ask where did the money come from, it's overwhelmingly Fed purchases of treasuries, which have as an offset increase in bank reserves at the Fed. So on paper, this has all been financed by an increase in the monetary base. But it's not inflationary, because that's really an alternative way of saying this, is that the private sector has lots of savings with no place to go and is funneling it to the federal government via banks and then on to the Fed. So I don't think it's inflationary. Clearly it's not. I mean, if we actually look at what's happening so far, is outside food and basically food, which is where there are supply chain disruptions, but it's not part of the core inflation measure, prices are falling. So I think it's not. Let me just come back to this stabilizing institutions. So if you went back in 2007 or so, I think many of us had a vision of a world in which a kind of a co-dominion in which the European Union and the United States would act as joint, shared democratic values, shared concern about a stable and rules-governed international order, and that they would act as sort of co-hegemons, because the United States was no longer the dominant power it had once been. And both sides of that have really been damaged. The EU has clearly had lots of credibility problems. The Euro area's response has been problematic. And I don't think there are any other plausible candidates. However, the possibility of a revitalization of both is there. I mean, we hope for it, that the United States can get back to, we hope, being a better player. That the European, this Franco-German pact, which in some ways is a response to the German courts saying, well, we can't actually, in effect, is saying that don't count on the ECB to do all of the lifting here. And then there've been a couple of facetious comments saying that maybe what we need is for the U.S. Supreme Court to say that the Fed can't do quantitative easing, and then maybe we'll actually get a responsible fiscal policy. But the point is that there's a possibility for revitalization. I don't think you want to give in to despair, but I do worry. I mean, the fact of the matter is that I complain about the U.S. response, and it's obviously it's mostly coming from the White House, but it's not. The abdication of responsibility is much broader than just one man. If there was in terms of economic policy, the single stupidest thing, it's hard to come up with. There's so many competitors there, but I think the single stupidest thing was the suggestion by one U.S. Senator, Lindsey Graham, that the United States, this is China's fault, and we should punish China by repudiating US government bonds that are owned by China. If you think about what that would do if it were actually to happen, my God. But you know, we hope that there are a lot of people of goodwill, and I think it's possible that we'll come out of this with a reassertion of some sense of responsibility. But it's going to be hard.
Well, we keep to close the session. We keep with the positive part of your answer to this question, which is to look forward to this transatlantic partnership that has always sustained very good outcomes for the world. Yeah. I want to thank actually the presence of Ambassador Erdem Bashi from Turkey and Ambassador Irena Sodi from Slovenia, because they are they're heading what we call the Friends of NAIC. And NAIC is this space for free thinking and free exchanging of views, and you prove the value, Paul, because at NAIC we say we don't need to have all the answers, but we need to raise the right questions, we hope, and I think that you got very good questions from the audience. And I want to actually recognize it was impressive that every one of the people that took the floor said you have influence one way or another the trend. Please don't levitate, just stay cool. But the fact is that that's true, and I want to really thank you for coming. Thank you for the good influence you have had in the international economic debate. Keep on recalling these issues and keep on supporting our quest to find better answers for these kind of questions. So thank you so much, Paul.
Well, thank you so much for the forum. That was a really good discussion, and I wish it were true that I had influence. My perception is that I don't. But okay, good luck on all, and let's do what we can.
Okay. And thank you to William Hines that I didn't see, but thank you for organizing this, and to Barry and Alan. And till the next NAIC seminar. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, take care then.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.